tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Teresa Torralba y soy la presidenta de Fundación INECO. Le doy la bienvenida al 13º Simposio Científico Ciencia de Datos en las Disciplinas Clínicas, bajo la dirección científica del doctor Marcelo Cetkovich, director médico y director del Departamento de Psiquiatría de INECO, y la coordinación científica de Daniel Lowe, de la Universidad de Harvard y del MIT. Todos sabemos que en la actualidad las herramientas computacionales están transformando la investigación en salud mental. Observamos cómo algunos algoritmos de las ciencias de datos comienzan a dar las respuestas que la psiquiatría y las personas afectadas de trastornos mentales esperan desde hace años. Antes de hacer la introducción al doctor Facundo Manes, querría agradecer a los laboratorios Gador y Bagó por acompañarnos en este tan importante simposio. Desde Fundación INECO estamos muy honrados entonces de haber convocado a 4 expertos internacionales en el campo del conocimiento sobre la ciencia de datos, y esperamos que esta conferencia nos permita ampliar nuestro conocimiento como una herramienta auxiliar de las ciencias humanas. Ahora me gustaría darle la bienvenida al doctor Facundo Manes, fundador de la Fundación INECO. El doctor Manes es profesor de la Universidad Favaloro en Argentina y de la Universidad de California en San Francisco. Se desempeña como consultor de la Cognition and Brain Science Unit, Medical Research Council de la Universidad de Cambridge e investigador del CONICET. Es el presidente de la International Society for Frontotemporal Dementia y, como saben, ha dado varias vueltas al mundo como conferencista invitado en distintos foros internacionales y publicado más de 250 contribuciones científicas en las revistas más prestigiosas de su especialidad, tales como Brain, JAMA, Neurology, Nature, Human Behavior, Neurology, The Lancet Neurology y Nature Neuroscience. Hoy nos compartirá a modo de introducción lo que él quiera acerca de la ciencia de datos.
Gracias, Teresa. Gracias a todos por participar de este fascinante evento. Felicitaciones al doctor Cetkovich, a la Fundación INECO. Los trastornos cerebrales son una de las mayores amenazas para la salud pública y deben considerarse como uno de los principales desafíos de la actualidad por el impacto humano, médico, social y económico. Se estima que las enfermedades del cerebro afectan a cerca de 1.000 millones de personas de todos los grupos etarios y de todas las regiones geográficas. También hay que considerar el acceso limitado a la educación o la imposibilidad de reinserción profesional que pueden sufrir estos pacientes. Las principales patologías mentales y del comportamiento son los trastornos depresivos, unipolares, de ansiedad, del desarrollo, la adicción al alcohol, a las drogas, y particularmente en el mundo del desarrollo se estará cada vez más agobiado por estos trastornos cerebrales. A medida que las economías sigan envejeciendo, un buen ejemplo es China, donde las enfermedades mentales ya han superado al corazón, a las enfermedades cardíacas, a las enfermedades oncológicas, y se han transformado en la mayor porción del presupuesto de atención de la salud en ese país. A diferencia de las enfermedades del corazón, el cáncer, la carga de las enfermedades del cerebro se manifiesta en efectos no solo en los pacientes, sino en los cuidadores. Y es fundamental el apoyo, la contención hacia el paciente, pero también a los otros enfermos que son los familiares. Y también hay un fuerte estigma actualmente sobre estas personas. Además de padecer la enfermedad, sufren conductas discriminatorias y muchas veces por la sociedad. Estas actitudes se basan en la desaprobación de alguien por poseer determinado rasgo distintivo o conducta que es visto de manera negativa por los otros. Así la enfermedad se convierte en una suerte de marca a rechazar. Y esa etiqueta, ese estereotipo, esa segregación de los demás y la consiguiente pérdida de posición social determinan la construcción de este enigma. Se trata de una clara forma de discriminación que puede realizarse al rechazar cierta condición o expresarse al evitar a alguien por atribuírsele características negativas como presumir que podría estar inestable, violento, peligroso debido a la condición que posee. Y a lo largo de la historia, esto no es nuevo, las personas con enfermedades mentales han sido excluidas o incluso brutalizadas. Se ha llegado a vincular estas patologías con la posesión demoníaca. Otras representaciones arraigadas tienen que ver con la idea de que los padecimientos psíquicos son una elección, sobre todo los relacionados con la alimentación y el consumo de sustancias. O sea, mucha gente piensa que dependen de la voluntad o que son autoinfligidos. Y todo esto lleva a una gran incomprensión hacia quienes padecen estas enfermedades. Asimismo, la falta de comprensión por parte de la familia o muchas veces del entorno, las menores oportunidades de inserción social y la propia creencia de la persona de que nunca se tendrá éxito o nunca podrá mejorar, perpetúan también el aislamiento y contribuye a que tiendan a evitar la búsqueda de ayuda o tratamiento para eludir las consecuencias sociales negativas de un diagnóstico. La prevención de los trastornos de salud mental, la promoción del bienestar mental, la provisión de un tratamiento del diagnóstico, son fundamentales. Y este tiene que ver con el simposio que la Fundación INECO, bajo la coordinación del doctor Setkovich, han organizado en el día de hoy. Este simposio es específicamente sobre la utilización de herramientas de inteligencia artificial, de la ciencia de datos en las disciplinas clínicas. Vamos a escuchar a los mayores expertos del mundo, encabezados por una leyenda que es el profesor Thomas Insel, que fue durante 15 años director del Instituto Nacional de Salud Mental de los Estados Unidos. Estos investigadores tan prestigiosos, a los que agradecemos su tiempo, su presencia, su expertise, nos explicarán las diversas instancias en las cuales los avances en las ciencias nos van a transformar las disciplinas clínicas. Cómo van a ayudar las herramientas computacionales, digitales, cómo se van a convertir en un auxilio, en herramientas auxiliares de la práctica clínica cotidiana, cómo van a coexistir con el clínico, con el médico, la médica. Y también tenemos que perder el miedo a la deshumanización. Vimos con la pandemia que la tecnología nos brinda herramientas increíbles y vamos a un mundo híbrido en las aulas, en los consultorios, en las empresas. Creo que se va a transformar la medicina sin deshumanizarla. Por el contrario, se va a mejorar la medicina brindando herramientas auxiliares que van a mejorar los diagnósticos. Y para nada tenemos que pensar en el reemplazo de la interacción humana. El cerebro aprende cuando algo nos inspira, nos motiva y nos parece un ejemplo. Por eso la relación entre el médico y el paciente no va a ser reemplazada por la tecnología. Pero claramente la tecnología nos va a permitir mejores diagnósticos, como lo ha hecho hasta ahora, llegar a más personas, ayudar a más personas, estar conectados en un mundo cada vez más interconectados. Y este simposio, uno de los primeros en nuestra región de abordar este tema, nos va a dar una puesta al día de cómo la ciencia puede hacer previsiones de todo tipo en el campo de la salud mental. Vamos a conocer qué se está usando, cómo se están usando estas herramientas para hacer predicciones clínicas, diagnósticas, terapéuticas y de pronóstico de la enfermedad. Vamos a tener diferentes conferencistas, Tom Insel, Emily Prud-Homeau, el doctor Ghosh del MIT, el doctor Juan. O sea, tenemos hoy la posibilidad de escuchar a los expertos más calificados del mundo en combinación con clínicos, con expertos en salud mental de nuestra región. Y para mí es un enorme privilegio haber sido invitado a dar estas palabras de apertura. Les agradezco a la Fundación INECO, a la doctora Torralba, al doctor Setkovich, a toda la Fundación INECO por el enorme trabajo que hacen para las 3 misiones que pensamos cuando se fundó la Fundación INECO, que es educar a la sociedad en temas de enfermedades del cerebro, proveer educación continua a los colegas en el mundo hispanoparlante y también apoyar la investigación científica. Hoy tengo el enorme placer de que esta misión se está cumpliendo y con creces. Como ejemplo está este simposio de impacto internacional que en el medio de este contexto pandémico ha organizado la Fundación INECO. Muchas gracias y bienvenidos.
Muy bien, buenas tardes a todos ustedes y gracias por estar aquí. Mi nombre es Marcelo Setkovich y soy el director médico de INECO. Ahora voy a hablar en inglés para presentar a nuestro invitado estrella de hoy. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Thomas Insel, a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist that for almost 15 years led the National Institute of Mental Health of the United States of America. He's the kind of person that is always leading the path to find new ways for answering all questions of psychiatry. Once he realized that the psychiatry of diagnostic manuals carried research of mental illness to an end road, he prompted one of the most ambitious projects to order neurobiological research in a set of dimensional domains called the research domain criteria. Our dogs have been leading the field since then. But shortly after this great project, he kicked the board again to leave the Institute and start a journey of discovery within the newly born ocean of technology and computational science in the field of mental health. Since then, he pushed several projects like Human Care, a therapeutic digital community for recovery, and is developing Mindsight, a digital publication on mental health. It is worth mentioning that Professor Insel's foresights were painfully confirmed during this pandemic, where telemedicine was at the front line of duty. It was said that information is data in context, knowledge the way we use them, and wisdom the real meaning of both of them. Dr. Insel is one of a kind that gathers all the information and makes sense of them. He will share right now his wisdom with us. Professor Insel, thank you very much for joining us together. We are really, really honored by your presence.
Well, thank you very much. Hope you will tolerate my speaking in English. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this symposium from the INECO Foundation. It's an extraordinarily important topic. I'm going to just quickly make sure we can turn off my own translation so that I can hear myself speak. Just a moment here, and we'll get back to slides. Very good. So the topic that I've been asked to speak about is, will data science transform psychiatry? And certainly this can be a brief lecture in the sense that I think it's undeniable that the answer to that question is yes. In fact, one could argue that of all the areas of medicine that will be transformed by technology and data science, psychiatry may be the most profoundly affected. Usually when we talk about how, where, and when technology will affect any area of goods or services, the first question we have to define is what's the problem that needs to be solved? And I'd like to do that and cover these three areas in the course of the next 25 minutes. First, to define that problem, to talk about what some of the solutions could be, and then some of the challenges to being able to implement those solutions. And fortunately, I'll be followed by other speakers, Dr. Prudhomme and Ghosh and Wong, who will go deeper into many of these issues around particular solutions. But I hope to be able to frame up some of the major issues for you so that you'll have a way to put their comments and their research into some context. So let's talk first about the problem. And as you just heard a few moments ago from Dr. Manas, there is a real issue here of a mental health crisis, that we are seeing no reduction in morbidity, in fact, an increase in morbidity, where neuropsychiatric disorders now surpass virtually all other healthcare areas in terms of the amount of disability that is reported. In addition to that, there's a true increase in mortality as measured by suicide, which is really quite striking. We've seen this about 33% increase in suicide since the beginning of this century. Over the past 4 or 5 decades, remarkable decreases in mortality from stroke, heart disease, AIDS, and most strikingly, childhood leukemia. So many areas of medicine have seen remarkable progress. While we have had progress in the science of mental health, we have more people in care, we have more treatments available. Oddly, the statistics for morbidity and mortality have not reflected that. In fact, if you put the mortality beyond suicide into the greater context of deaths of despair, that includes overdoses from a variety of drugs and deaths connected to alcohol, particularly cirrhosis deaths, you're looking at numbers which are really stunning. Even during this era of talking about pandemics, this is for the United States, 158,000 deaths in 2018, quite a bit more than that. It will probably come out to be closer to 200,000 in 2020. And you can see how that compares to where we were even just 25 years ago. So there has been a remarkable increase in deaths of despair. So great, in fact, that this is the first time in the United States, and I think this would be true for many Latin American countries as well, that we've seen a decrease in overall longevity even prior to COVID. COVID, of course, has increased that. And COVID has, in fact, also increased the mental health crisis itself by increasing the amount of depression and suicidal ideation. And we've seen this most of all, oddly enough, in people under the age of 25, where the virus itself has been the greatest threat to people over 65. The psychological consequences of this pandemic have played out mostly for the younger population, so significantly that the United Nations has warned of this being, in fact, a second pandemic. So as I say this, when we point to morbidity and mortality being so high prior to the pandemic, increasing with the pandemic, and as we move out of this, one expects that many of the mental health consequences will be residue of this viral pandemic. It really does, I think, put a clear emphasis on the idea that we are in a crisis. It's a little different than a pandemic or an infectious disease crisis caused by a new infectious agent. There's not such a profound increase in prevalence of mental disorders, but there's a profound loss of care. It's a care crisis, not a typical health crisis in the sense of an emerging new agent. So why do we have it? I think the care crisis can be explained by at least three factors, which I must say we frequently overlook. First is a lack of engagement, that most of the people who could and should be in mental health care or behavioral health care, if one includes substance abuse, most of them are not in care. And that is also, of course, true for many other areas of medicine, such as in cancer and heart disease. The difference here being that as one becomes more ill and more seriously disabled, it's even less likely that the patient will be engaged in care. So that provides a particularly difficult set of circumstances where people only end up in care when they're in a full crisis. There's a lack of quality of care. The care that's given, not just in the United States, but in Argentina and many other countries, is fragmented, it's episodic, it's reactive, and there's a lack of accountability. We don't measure outcomes. And it's been said by many people that when you don't measure outcomes, your confidence grows more quickly than your competence. That may be very much the case there. So let's talk a bit here about solutions. What can be done? And the most important point I want to make is that while we have very good treatments, some of them are medical, some are psychological, some are more rehabilitative, that the fact that those treatments by themselves have not been able to reduce morbidity and mortality, and they haven't been able to address these issues of engagement, quality, and accountability, tells you that we need some other way to approach this set of problems. And here I want to make the case that I think technology and data science really can make the difference. It shouldn't be so surprising if you think about how goods and services are delivered to all of us today in this digital age. And you think about Amazon or other sorts of service delivery platforms like that, Google Search. We have a world that's become consumer focused, that's on demand. It's very information rich. And you as a consumer have agency. It's a proactive system. Very different from our healthcare system, which is still very much focused on the needs of providers or payers. It's been largely, up until this past year, a brick and mortar based system, not a virtual one. Care is often delayed. It's very difficult to get the kind of competitive information or the comparison shopping that you would have for other goods and services. So it's not an information-rich situation. Highly reactive, as I just mentioned, it tends to be initiated during crisis, not proactively as one might want. The good news here is that when you look at our three problem statements, engagement, quality, and accountability, there are solutions for each of them with the help of technology and data science. There's person-centered care, there's ways of training and coordinating care better, and there's measurement based care and value-based care. We'll talk about each of these in turn, but I wanted to put this up as a kind of initial introduction to this next part of our conversation. Let's look at person-centered online care, and I'll give you just one example, but there are many to consider. When you talk about engagement as a problem, it's quite interesting because generally technology is considered to be addictive and to be a part of the problem, not part of the solution when it comes to mental health. But the fact that it is so addictive says that there are tools for engagement that are embedded in the technologies we use, whether that's social media or video games, that we ought to be using in mental health care. This is just one company which I had co-founded. I'm no longer part of the company. It's called Humanist Care. And they decided to really focus on this particular target of engagement. And they they went after the very things that were keeping people out of care by providing in-the-moment evidence-based care, giving people agency, focusing on solutions, not on problems, and sort of designing with patients, just as we do for any other technology, what solutions would make most sense. So very much consumer-focused design, something that almost never happens in healthcare, but happens in virtually every other technology-driven industry. They also understood that one of the most powerful ways to engage people is to help them to become not just people who receive care, but people who can also provide care. So they created communities. In this case, a little bit like Peloton has done in the world of physical fitness, membership-based, but communities where you have a coach, but where you share your experience with others, they share with you, and you together, as you might do with Alcoholics Anonymous, help people to recover. Quality, a really great example, I think, is a company called INECO Health in the UK. It's a company that does CBT online, so it's teletherapy, but it collects every intervention, every therapy session is collected either by voice or in text and taken through a natural language processing engine to be able to analyze exactly what the clinical state of the patient and the therapist can be, providing real-time feedback to the therapist in terms of how they're getting through, what the therapeutic alliance looks like, how well the patient is responding. As they've begun to do this, they've found that their therapists have just gotten far, far better by getting this real-time feedback about how they're providing CBT by text or by phone. And you can see that their recovery rates have increased from 46% to 67% as they've been able to put this in play. By the way, they have treated now well over 100,000 patients in the National Health Service in the UK. The graph on the right represents 3,000 patients who were studied over a course of 10 different cohorts to look at increases in recovery rates with depression and this kind of natural language processing informed CBT. Third point around accountability, incredibly important to begin to measure what we do. And so simply building dashboards the way one might for diabetes or hypertension, but to provide continual feedback to both the patient and the provider about how somebody's doing is fundamental to any improvement in quality and in outcomes. We call this measurement-based care. This is one particular company called Owl Insights that does this, but there are many that build these sorts of dashboards. And while there's been a tremendous focus on improving access with phones through telehealth, what we've really failed to do in this telehealth era of the past year is to begin to use the phone in the way that gives us that kind of accountability, those kinds of measurements. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about something that I call telehealth 2.0. It's the opportunity to take the sensors, the kind of information that's available on the phone, and turn that into data that gives you, like with IESO's natural language processing, some true insights into how the patient and, for that matter, the provider are doing. If you think about what we would love to have in terms of measuring mood, cognition, and behavior, it's really not that surprising. It's very different from what we do today, which is to just collect subjective data, to do it on our schedule, to do it in the clinic, and to do it often in a way that requires quite a bit of time for both the patient and the provider. What we need is obviously an objective, continuous, ecological, and passive system to do that. As I mentioned, it's only then that we begin to measure that our competence can increase faster than our confidence. And the smartphone is obviously the best tool to do that. These phones are, to me, still, it's extraordinary that we're holding in our pockets a supercomputer that is far more powerful than the most expensive, most powerful supercomputer that I would have had when I was in research 30 years ago. That was the Cray 2 supercomputer at a cost of $32 million. weighing, as you can see, 2,500 kilograms, and yet far less powerful than a simple iPhone that, or even a Pixel phone that many people will have, virtually anybody in practice would have at this point. Many people have pointed out the enormous amount of information that's available. There's something called the Human Screenome Project that's beginning to collect that information and to annotate it and understand what signals really matter. It's something we can talk more about as people are interested. This has introduced this whole concept of digital phenotyping, the idea that we can understand people just the way we do genotyping. We can understand their behavior, their cognition, their mood by collecting these signals. And there are probably three categories of signals to think about. The sensor signals that can tell you how active somebody is, how social they are, from just looking at a comparison of incoming to outgoing text or incoming to outgoing emails. You can look at human-computer interaction. How does somebody actually use the keyboard in terms of their reaction time and their accuracy? And then voice and speech, the natural language processing piece of trying to understand how somebody's functioning as they speak. You know, if one thinks about this, it's not so different from what we do in the real world of clinical care, except that is still very subjective. This provides us an objective tool to do very much of that. The other thing we could do here is to look at social media posts and search terms, if it were done with consent, to capture something of what you might consider digital exhaust. Paper out just recently showed how much of suicide intent is revealed through those kinds of posts, and yet very little of that is used in clinical care. It's one thing to collect the data, quite another to actually turn that into information that's usable and to actually give you the ability to have a phenotype that in practice can improve outcomes. I just want to take a moment to unpack this a little bit more, because if one thinks about it in terms of what would be the signals that would matter, you could imagine that for issues such as measuring sleep or looking at the early phases of mania or changes in rhythms with depression or even activity for someone with a diagnosis of ADHD, those activity sensors could be really helpful. Similarly, the GPS sensor for those who have an avoidance issue. Looking at screen use can be really helpful to know where people are going, especially people with addiction. And then this idea of looking at social behavior on the phone is an enormous opportunity that has been largely neglected. One particular area, I just want to touch on this briefly, is the use of these tools for understanding psychosis. Here, I think natural language processing can give us objective ways to measure all of these aspects of thought disorder. And it can do that in real time, giving us an opportunity to provide kind of, if you will, a quantitative as well as a qualitative sense of whether someone has a thought disorder. And you can imagine how this would be helpful, not just for a master clinician who's been doing this for years, but for a nurse or a volunteer or anyone in an emergency room doing crisis assessment, perhaps somebody who's on a suicide hotline, people who are working in a global health environment where there isn't anybody with a huge amount of clinical experience to do thought disorder assessment, or in primary care. So enormous clinical need here without yet the clinical tools that we would want to be able to improve the quality of care and outcomes. There's several companies that are working on these issues. And I think, to go back to the original question, will technology transform mental health care? This will be one of the ways in which that'll happen. Just one more example, which is from a former company of mine, MindStrong, that developed a way of looking at that human-computer interaction to be able to, using machine learning algorithms, to train up the way that people were actually functioning on their phone, their taps, their typing, the speed, the way that they would scroll, and found that that haptic experience of how they use the phone mapped beautifully onto cognitive performance. This is in, I think, 13 or 27 individuals, showing that in each individual, for various aspects of cognitive, their cognitive performance, there were signals that were very predictive and highly correlated. So just to summarize, what I'm suggesting is that for each of these problems, there are indeed solutions that can make a huge difference, that we know how to do this already in a kind of initial way. It's still early in some sense for where we need to go, but ultimately the goal, that vision, is to think about using technology and data science in a kind of virtuous cycle. So we have interventions that can be delivered remotely, as with what we've talked about with telehealth. That's everything from coaching to crisis intervention. We have ways of coordinating care and capturing data better with improving quality with care management. And we've just spoken about the digital phenotyping. But the critical piece here is to put all of this together into what we call a learning engine, so that you begin to know very quickly what's working and what isn't, what you need to do more of and what you need to do less of, so that you can drive towards better outcomes and better results. Something that I think we have failed to do in this field. And that's one of the reasons why I think, in spite of having very good treatments and having many, many people more than ever in treatment, we're not seeing better outcomes. I'll finish by just looking at that final bullet point about the challenges and asking, where are we? What do we need to do? The first, I think, is we have to ask the question of, is this really working yet? Does it actually do what we're saying? Can it improve real world outcomes? Is it going to be adopted? Will it save time and money and care? And I think that question is still a work in progress. We have lots of work going on in both the public sector and the private sector to try to answer these questions. We're getting initial results that would suggest that in some areas, outcomes are better, as I showed you with the IESO example for CBT in the UK, that clearly having that kind of feedback in real time with CBT therapists does improve outcomes. But I have to say that that is still the exception, not the rule. Many companies in this space measure their success in the amount of money they've raised or the number of users they have. So much of the conversation these days is about access, not about quality, not about outcomes. We have more to do to answer these questions. The second, and I think equally important issue is, will people want to do this? Is there trust in technology? We've seen so many violations of privacy, so many violations of trust from the tech industry. Is this really digital phenotyping, or is it surveillance? Are the data being collected to monetize for advertising and marketing, or are they being collected to help me? And I think questions about the data and its provenance, who collects it, when's it collected, where does it go, who owns it, who has control of it? These are really the critical issues that need to be entirely clarified to build trust in this new aspect of behavioral health care. My sort of North Star in thinking about this is that you want to think about, are we empowering patients and families with information and connection? I think if that's what one works towards, then there's every reason to think that indeed technology and data science will transform mental health and will do it for the better. So just to summarize, we're in a crisis right now, both in mental health and mental health care. We do have solutions that work for engagement, quality, and accountability. Implementing those is going to require proving out the value and ensuring trust in this new technology. I want to thank you for your attention. I hope this was understandable, and look forward to any questions or comments.
Professor Insel, thank you very much. This was a great presentation, and I guess you gave us really a hint of what is coming in mental health. I'm surprised and completely agree with you that we are in a mental health care crisis most of all, and this is really shocking to hear. We have a couple of questions for you. You mentioned digital phenotyping. We do know that classical categories failed to find strong links to neurobiology. But many psychiatrists think that phenomenology found some commonalities within categories. There is something there. This is the idea. Do you think that artificial intelligence could help us in uncovering the hidden architecture of canonical categories in psychiatry?
Well, I really like that question very much. That was the basis for the RDoC, or Research Domain Criteria project, that I started in my days at NIMH. And we simply had this idea that rather than presupposing from clinical symptoms or from clinical observation where the categories would be, we should collect lots of data, many, many different kinds of data, and try with machine learning and artificial intelligence to understand where the more rational, more effective categories might actually reside. And maybe, as we've seen with cancer, it's not at all based on geography, for instance. In cancer, it turns out to be the molecular biology of the cancer that's the most important for selecting treatments. And maybe we'd find something analogous in the case of depression or PTSD or anxiety disorders, that there's some latent feature that's not quite obvious to us in the way that we see patients, but perhaps would come out with natural language processing, perhaps in objective data about activity and sleep. That as we begin to bring in objective data and different kinds of data, maybe EEG data or imaging data, that we'd begin to see categories that were more useful and more predictive of treatment response, helping to support clinical decision-making. I should point out that no matter how much of this objective data we're collecting, the subjective experience of the patient is still going to be primary. And it's no matter what your digital phenotyping tells you about someone's mood, if they don't feel depressed, I don't think there's going to be much value in trying to convince them that they are based on their smartphone data. So it's still a matter of having subjective data, but now in augmenting that with objective information, which most other areas of medicine would do automatically, but we've been slow to incorporate in mental health because we haven't had a source. The phone actually begins to give us that kind of information, or wearable data begins to give us that.
Thank you. And the second and last question, how do you envision next generation psychiatrists will find a way to profit technology without forgetting humanism and empathy?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Let's be clear about this, that if you look at the role of technology in the rest of medicine, at least the kinds of things we're talking about here, like the electronic medical record, it's been horrific. You know, even as a patient, I have that experience of going to the doctor and they're looking at the computer screen and not at me. And they're spending more time on the numbers and on the documentation than they are on the physical exam and on the personal interaction with me as a patient. I don't see that as progress. So the worst thing, because psychiatry is one place where we still listen to patients, and we listen both to what they say and what they don't say. And we understand at a much deeper level what's going on with the person, because that's what we're there for, is to be part of that relationship. It's a relational interaction. And we mustn't lose that. I think what we have to think about is ways to augment that, ways to improve that. And maybe what that means is that much of what we're talking about here goes on outside of the office. It goes on outside of the interaction, but you collect data more ecologically, so that when you see somebody, you can begin to talk to them about what happened to them last week when you notice that they didn't get out of bed for 36 hours. Those are the kinds of things that we're not able to do today, but it would be a terrible, I think, misgiving of what technology can do if what it ends up doing is actually undermining the relational aspect of what physicians can provide to patients.
That's great. Professor Insel, I would like to thank you very much again for sharing this time with us. It was really enlightening for us to hear your lecture. And I think that most of us take the message to home to look to the future with another kind of eye on technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. Good luck.
Bueno, vamos a continuar con nuestra próxima disertante. Es un placer presentarles a la profesora Emily Prudhomme. Emily is the Junio Family Sesquicentennial Assistant Professor in Computer Science at Boston College. And her research deals with natural language processing for health and accessibility, with a focus on clinical speech and language, small data sets, and low resource languages. So her presentation will be computational modeling and semantic fluency responses for clinical assessment. Emily, thank you very much for being today with us. It's a pleasure for us, and we hear you with kind attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm really excited to talk to you today, especially after that last talk. As many of you probably know, in a neuropsychological exam, a lot of times the patients will be presented with some stimulus and then be asked to provide a spoken response. And these can be different kinds of stimuli, verbal stimuli, prompts for information, topics for discussion. This is a classic example, the cookie theft picture description, where a patient will be shown the picture and asked to describe the actions happening in the picture. Another common exam like this, the patient listens to a narrative and then has to tell it back to the examiner. And there are standard scoring procedures for these. For instance, how many actions in the picture were described, how many components of the narrative were recalled. But you can also think of these responses as a source of data to be analyzed linguistically in terms of the different kinds of information that might provide data about whether someone has a particular neurological condition. For instance, seniors with dementia use less complex language, even if they provide the same information. It's presented in a less complex way. Children with autism might miss the gist of a story. And today I'm going to be talking about a particular a task in a neuropsychological exam called the semantic fluency task, also called the verbal fluency task or category fluency task, in which the patient has to name as many items from a particular category as they can in 60 seconds. And the score is typically the number of unique items named. And this requires a strong working memory and executive function. And low scores and crucially, unusual naming strategies are associated with a variety of conditions, including dementia, schizophrenia, depression, autism spectrum disorder. So when you move away from the standard scoring procedure to these scoring procedures that rely on analysis of language, it can get complicated because doing that is very time consuming, it requires a lot of expertise, and it can be very subjective. And in my work, I propose using natural language processing methods to address these kinds of problems because they're quick, they're very objective, and the only expertise you need is at the beginning when you're building your models. And I'll talk a little bit about NLP. The previous speaker actually touched on NLP quite a few times, which is great. So NLP, natural language processing, is the branch of AI and machine learning focusing on getting computers and computational models to deal with language, to understand it, to analyze it, sometimes even to generate it. And we use NLP all the time now. In the last 10 years, we've gone from not really relying on it at all to it being a part of our everyday lives. NLP is what helps us with search, completing our search requests. NLP is what works for us when we're doing spelling correction. NLP is the predictive text you can use when you're writing text messages. And of course, if you use Alexa or Siri or the Google personal assistant, all of the technology that's powering that is natural language processing. And as the previous speaker mentioned, there's been a lot of work on incorporating natural language processing into clinical assessment for a lot of neurological and psychiatric conditions. And this is really exciting. There's been a lot of work on social media, sort of trying, Facebook for a period of time, would try to detect if someone was expressing suicidal ideation in their posts. They've been using chatbots to get people to sort of open up. But there are problems with this. Things can go very wrong. These are, when you let a computer do whatever it wants, things can go awry sometimes. And there have been many high-profile examples of this happening. So a lot of what I talk about when I talk about this is how do we use natural language processing in a way that is helpful to clinicians, where it can still be under control. It's not the case that we're going to replace clinicians with NLP. It's that NLP is going to be a tool and a resource for clinicians as they're coming to a diagnosis or looking for improvements or trying to apply interventions. And I'm talking about a very specific application of this, and I'll get into some of the details about the NLP today. So first I want to talk a little bit about the semantic fluency or verbal fluency category fluency task. So again, this is where you are given some category and you have to name as many items in that category as you can in a limited amount of time. And certain naming strategies that are found to be sort of atypical are associated with different neurological conditions. I want to talk the corpora I'll be describing today. We've been collecting sort of semantic fluency responses from a variety of different people over many, many years of the various people I've worked with. Here I say we have 77 responses from neurotypical adults, who we've recruited online through crowdsourcing. We actually have 500 now, but I just got that data yesterday from my student and I didn't have time to incorporate it in the talk today. We're also looking at 527 seniors with and without dementia, 99 little kids with and without autism and language or language impairment, and then 42 teenagers with and without autism. But I'm going to be focusing explicitly on subgroups of these two data sets today. So what are the neurotypical strategies for carrying out making a response to the verbal fluency task? The first sort of strategy that was recognized was this cluster and switch strategy, where you take some subcategory of the main category, think of all the animals, all the items that belong to that category. And when you exhaust that category, you switch to a new category. So here we have pets, then we have safari animals or savanna animals, and then there are farm animals. But it turns out that this is not the only strategy people use. People also use something called the semantic chaining strategy, where the final element or final elements of a particular subcategory serve as a jumping off point for a new but related subcategory. So here we have an example of dog, cat. The patient has exhausted their knowledge of pets and they use cat as a jumping off point for felines. They run out of felines and they use lion as a jumping off point for safari animals, savanna animals, and they use zebra as a jumping off point for sort of horse-like animals, horse for farm animals, and then chicken for birds. And this is actually very common too. And both of these strategies are actually widely used and sort of mixed and matched by people, neurotypical people, when they're carrying out this task. So you could go through and, if you had a bunch of patients who were doing this, you could automatically annotate where you thought those chains or clusters began and ended. But this takes a lot of time and it requires training, and it's very hard to do consistently unless you're just, you have a set of rules and you sit down and you practice and you do many of these sort of annotations. And furthermore, the trends that you observe might be difficult for a human to observe reliably in a large data set. So I consider two potential solutions to, if we want to get this information, we don't want to do manual annotations, what can we do? One thing we could do is collect human similarity judgments, give people pairs of animals and ask how similar they are. And if two animals aren't similar enough, you could say that there was a cluster boundary there or a chain boundary there. We can also use natural language processing to do the same sort of thing. And I'm going to talk about that. I think we can all agree that these two animals are similar in some way, but we can also say that these two animals are similar. They're not similar in the same way. A cat and a lion are not similar in the same way that cat and a dog are, but we can agree that these are animals that belong to, each one belongs to a particular subcategory. This one, less so. This pair of animals and this pair of animals really have very little in common. These would be very unsimilar. And people actually agree on this quite well when, even if you just give them very vague instructions like, are these two animals similar? People tend to agree. So this is something that we have at our disposal in our head somewhere, and it's probably what we are tapping into when we carry out a response to a verbal fluency task. So I was interested in just asking people how similar they thought two animals were, with the idea that you could use these similarity judgments to predict where the boundaries were between semantic chains. So we took every adjacent pair of animals in our animal list, and we used crowdsourced workers to evaluate the similarity between 50 of these pairs. And each pair is evaluated by 5 Turkers. And they judged the similarity on a scale from 1 to 7. And this is what the survey looked like. There was a little slider where the person could indicate how similar or how different they thought the two animals were. And they could check a box saying they didn't know the animal too, because we do have some unusual animals from our data set. And we get results that are perfectly expected. Hog and pig are very similar. In fact, a hog is a kind of pig, it's a male pig. Monkey and baboon are very similar, and then ocelot and amoeba are not very similar at all. And the sort of intuitions you would have are reflected in that data set. Now, knowing how similar two animals are can help us identify the boundaries between these semantic chains or these semantic clusters, or other patterns too. But here's the thing: is this was very difficult to collect, and as I mentioned, we just collected 400 something more verbal fluency responses from neurotypical crowdsourced workers, and we got a whole bunch of new pairs. We got a whole 1,000 new pairs, and we had to send those pairs out to more crowdsourced workers to get their similarity judgments. So getting new pair judgments of pairs is expensive and takes time. So we would like to try to collect these sorts of judgments, but do it automatically using natural language processing. So there's many different components of natural language processing, but something that has become very, very important in the last, say, 10 years is ways of modeling how similar two texts are. And in particular, we're looking here at how similar two words are. And a common way to do this is something called word embeddings. And the idea about a word embedding is that words that are used in a similar context are likely to be similar. And with word embeddings, what you try to do is create a vector of real values that represents where that word exists in some multidimensional semantic space. Okay? Those vectors are derived from the contexts in which the words were used in some really, really huge corpus. Okay? So words that appear in the same context have vectors that are very close to each other. So, and words whose vectors are close to each other or near each other are likely to be similar to each other. And I'll give you some examples here. First, just to show you kind of what would be happening when you build these sorts of models with a neural network. So here we have the word banking, and we're looking at the words around banking, and we see debt, problems, crisis, 2009. We see unified regulation, we have system. We see those same words around the word financial. We see crisis in 2009, we see debt problems, we see unified regulation system. Okay, so we're seeing the word banking and the word financial in the same context very, very often. This means that banking and financial are probably very similar to each other. A neural network, a word embedding neural network would be able to pick up on this and then generate vectors for those words that were close to each other in the multidimensional semantic space. When I say a vector, this is what I mean. It's not really human interpretable, right? This isn't even the full vector. It has 300 dimensions. You can see there's these little tiny numbers. It's not clear what any of the dimensions mean, and they shouldn't be particularly interpretable for a human. But when I know where a word exists in a semantic space, I can say, find all the other words that are nearby. And when you do that, you end up getting words that are very similar in meaning. Now, they're not all similar in meaning in the same way, but they're all sort of similar or related in some way. So the closest one to dog is dogs, which is, that's a morphological difference. It's plural. Puppy is a baby dog. Hooch is maybe a casual synonym for dog. Cat is not a dog at all, but we have agreed already that those are similar words, right? So that number on the right is the cosine similarity. It's a way of judging how similar the two words are. It's really the cosine distance. The cosine distance between the two word vectors. The closer it is to one, the more similar the two words are. The farther away it is from one, the more is a representation of words not being that similar. And what's neat about word vectors is that you can project them down to 2 dimensions. And then you can visualize where these words appear near each other. So here we can see that there's this nice cluster of, when we project these down to 2 dimensions, there's a nice cluster of pets here. There's a cluster of farm animals here. And there's a cluster of sort of African savanna animals over here. Word embeddings are widely used for many, many tasks. Any task that involves sort of thinking about the similarity of 2 texts. So this would include things like machine translation, analogies, predicting new words and sentences. In the examples that the previous speaker gave of sort of trying to extract information about a person's state or a person's affect at a given time, all of that would be done using these sorts of vector representations of words that are built from large corpora. But one thing that's surprising about this is that there's been very, very little work done on how these word embeddings correlate with explicit human judgments of similarity. Like we know intuitively that 2 words might be similar. It's not always entirely clear that the word embeddings actually correlate that well to these sort of human intuitions. And so word embeddings are not new or special. They've been around for a while, but word embeddings for semantic fluency, that's also not that new idea. Maybe 4 or 5 years people have been doing this, but almost all the work in this area has involved using what are called pre-trained models built with huge corpora. So there are very, very large corpora out there. You can, scrape the web and get billions and billions of words of text that you can then generate these embeddings from. Most people just grab a model from the web that looks big and good, that they've heard is good, and then they get their word similarities from there. And there actually has been very little research on the importance of picking a good corpus to build your model on and picking the right architecture to build your model on for a particular task, in particular for the verbal fluency task. People have used word embeddings a lot, but people have not necessarily been picking the word embeddings that maybe would be best suited for the task. So there are a variety of word embedding models you can grab on the web, and my student found this website that has a lot of them, and she tried them all for the task to see how well the similarity metrics that you can extract from these pre-trained word embeddings, how well they correlate to human word similarity judgments that we've collected. I mean, this is just a sampling of those couple dozen models, and we can see that some of them correlate very poorly with human judgments. Some of them correlate pretty well with human judgments. This one is going to correlate very poorly, probably because it was a corpus that was about the energy industry, and that's not really going to have a lot of information about animals in it. No one would use that anyway, but that's sort of to just demonstrate how poorly it will do if you use the wrong domain. The model with the best correlations to human judgments was actually a smaller model. It only had 2 to 3 billion words that it was built with, okay? But it was built specifically on Wikipedia. These others were built mostly on news corpora or sort of literature corpora, sort of mixed corpora, but mostly from just web data that has to do with news. So even though these are very, very, very huge, they don't correlate as well with human judgments as this sort of smaller but focused model. And this was really interesting to us because a lot of what people are doing is just grabbing this really big model, assuming the big model will be best, and not really thinking about, is this appropriate for this particular domain? So what we did, we wanted to know, okay, Wikipedia works better than the news. What if we only take the parts of Wikipedia that are relevant? Namely, since the most common verbal fluency category is animals, and that's the one that we've been collecting data for. What if we build it with just information from Wikipedia about animals? So we took the animal entry from Wikipedia and the biology and culture entries from Wikipedia, and then everything that every page on the animal page that was a link, we followed that link and got that page too. And every page on that was a link, we got that page too. So we ended up getting everything from Wikipedia that connected in some way to animals, and everything from Wikipedia that connected in some way to biology. So I'm just repeating the best pre-trained model here, which had a correlation of 0.462. When we train models specifically on our own targeted domain data that we got from Wikipedia, we actually get much higher correlations. So this 0.633, that was the highest correlation we got with human judgments. And that was using a relatively small data set, but using a particular architecture that lets us look at subwords. So it allows us to, consider things like plural and singular and things like that. And it looked at just animals and biology articles from Wikipedia, and it had pretty high correlation. So it's not the case that any model you pull off the shelf is going to work well. And this is actually a real issue that people who are coming from computer science are like, oh, great, there's this cool clinical data we can work with. We'll just use this model that we know has worked for other tasks in NLP. Well, that might not be the best model to use. You might have to actually tailor your model to the specific domain. But in the same way, a person who does clinical research might have a computer science undergraduate, and they give them this task, and the computer science undergraduate is like, oh, great, I'll take this model. And it ends up being not the best model for the task. So we want to use these similarity judgments to identify semantic chains. How do we do this? So what we ended up doing is sort of not very hard to understand. Here's an example, and we can see that each of these lines indicates that there is a boundary between a semantic chain. And what we wanted to do was find a threshold of a similarity metric. The similarity metric goes from 0 to 1, the cosine similarity. We want to find a threshold that maximizes the accuracy of chunking that verbal fluency response into chains, semantic chains. Okay, so here in this chart, we have this black line that indicates each of these points is the similarity, the cosine similarity between the two indicated animals. This red line is a threshold of 0.3, and we can see that every time the black line crosses the red line, whenever the black line is under the red line, it indicates that there's a boundary between the two animals, that those two animals are not part of the same semantic chain. So we can see here that it crosses underneath between dog and deer. That means that there was a new chain there. And every time the line is underneath, there's a new semantic chain boundary inserted. And so we can see that when we set this boundary at 0.3, that we end up getting 7 chains, and our mean chain length is 2.28, which is not that different from the manual annotation, which had 8 chains with a mean chain length of 2. So we did this, we found the best threshold using our mechanical Turk data, our non-clinical data. We found the best threshold for each of the different similarity models that we worked with. And we found that the human similarity scores actually do quite well. They have pretty high accuracy compared to the baseline, but it is the case that the pre-trained models do not correlate as highly with human similarity scores. Do not provide as high accuracy as human similarity scores as our custom model that was built specifically on a specific corpus. The pre-trained models do not perform as well, as accurately as the models that we built on a targeted corpus. So now we want to apply this to some clinical populations. The first clinical population we looked at was children with autism. These are kids, 22 kids in each group, matched on age, verbal IQ, and full scale IQ, since these are correlated pretty strongly with performance. And we applied the best threshold we found with the external data to this test data. And again, we found that human similarity scores produced fairly high accuracy, but the model that produced the highest accuracy for identifying those semantic chains in kids was actually the one built from the corpus, the Wikipedia animals corpus, and not just the biggest corpus we came across. We found very similar results when comparing seniors with and without mild cognitive impairment. Again, they were matched on age and years of education, because those are two things that are very strongly correlated with performance. And again, we find human similarity scores are more accurate than these pre-trained models but the models that we trained ourselves from the targeted in-domain data provided even higher accuracy than that. Now remember, why do we want to think about it, semantic chains in the first place? Well, maybe it's because counting the number of chains or the length of chains could tell us something about the neurological status of a patient, okay? So with our autism group, with those kids, we did not see any differences actually at all in the verbal fluency task. It's not entirely surprising. We have other things that we would like to look at, but we did see differences in the MCI versus typical aging group. So we found that participants with typical aging produce more items, and they also produce more chains. This is based on a manual insertion of chain boundaries. But we were able to replicate this result using the human similarity judgments. And you can see actually they're really spot on. They provide almost exactly, they result in almost exactly the same numbers as the manual chain count, which isn't entirely surprising. You would expect that because when you do those chain counts, you're relying on your similarity judgments. But we also found that our custom model, and none of the pre-trained models, that's PT, only our custom model was able to replicate this finding as well. Our custom model also ended up discovering that participants with typical aging produce more chains than participants with MCI. So manual annotations can capture very interesting features, but it is very difficult to do this. It takes a lot of time. It's difficult to do reliably. Computational methods offer a lot of potential, but you have to be very careful about how you use those methods. You can't just grab something off the shelf and expect it to work really well. You have to be careful about what you do. One thing that I think that embeddings are really promising for is picking up on things that humans would actually not be able to pick up on. One thing we found was that children, almost all the children in our group, this is all 99, said either cat, bear, or bear, cat. It was, I think, as many as 90% of the kids did that. For children, clearly, cat and bear are part of some chain, but none of the adults who are doing our annotations recognize that as part of a semantic chain. Cat and bear are too unlike each other. We want to know why. If we create a corpus targeted for children's language, we may be able to discover that. There may be stories that we don't know about that have a cat and a bear, and that's where the kids are coming up with this. This was one of our favorite examples. A kid had this list of animals, and we all thought, oh, these are each, it's, this kid is not semantic chaining at all. And in fact, the kid was talking about Winnie the Pooh, where all of these animals hang out together. As adults, it doesn't jump out at us as being animals that are similar, but for this kid, because they are all characters in a book, they were all similar and part of a semantic chain. I'd like to thank some of my collaborators. I've been working on this for a long time. So one of them is my retired thesis advisor, and the last two are my current undergraduate research assistant. The work was supported by a variety of NIH grants, and I'd like to express my thanks for that support. And that is all. I thank you for listening so much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Emily, thank you very much for this superb presentation. And we were wondering about the clinical utility of verbal fluency task, and we would like to know if you have any experience of using natural processing semantics analysis in, for example, in the diagnosis of dementia. It could be useful, for example, in the early differential diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or semantic dementia. And do you have any input on this?
Yes, so we did find some differences here, and I've actually done some work that I didn't present here, where we're finding other interesting differences too about the frequencies of words. So it's not just how the words are grouped together, but people with mild cognitive impairment, those early stages of dementia are often picking much more frequent words. And when they run out of the frequent words, they have to switch. That's one reason why they switch, because what's available to them is the most frequent words. And they have difficulty with that lexical retrieval. And then also the categorizations that people with dementia do are often very different. We'd like to get a little bit more into that in our future work, but we are finding some differences in frequency. That seems to be a finding we hadn't expected, and a finding that would be very difficult for a person to identify, because people don't necessarily have good intuitions about when a word is frequent or infrequent.
Perhaps not fully related with this semantic fluency analysis, but how far are we from incorporating the pitch of the language of prosody in the automatized analysis?
So we do, so there are some other projects I work on. One in particular is sort of automated scoring of language tasks for children to try to identify language impairments. And we're finding that, and which is actually very hard for clinicians to do. It takes a really long time. You have to, often people make a recording and go back and check because they aren't entirely sure they got it right. And we are having a lot of success with that, with you use automatic speech recognition. And from that, you don't even need to make a transcript. From the automatic speech recognition, we're able to score with very high accuracy, like in the 90s. And you can imagine this being very successful, and again, not replacing clinicians, but as a screening tool for children who live in places without access to clinicians who are trained to do this. This was, particularly during COVID, this would have been really useful too. Kids aren't able to come to the speech language pathologist in person. Could you have a screening tool that just administered these tasks and then scored them automatically, and then gave that information to the SLP somewhere else, who could then figure out what steps to take next, what additional tasks to have that kid do to come to a diagnosis. And this, we've also had some success with this for mild cognitive impairment, not so much for the verbal fluency, but for narrative recall. I have a couple of papers about that from the old days. You listen to a story, you have to tell it back. This is something where mild cognitive impairment has a really big impact. And we've been able to score that, again, just taking the speech without even having to get a transcript, just from a recording, being able to score that as a screening tool, to sort of just provide more information for a clinician.
And the last one, which are the main difficulties in the process of carry this analysis into another languages, for example, from English to Spanish?
That is a challenge. For Spanish, Spanish does have some advantages because there are these tools can be used on Spanish because Spanish has a lot of really big corpora. So transferring it to something like Spanish would be more manageable. But one of the problems would just be getting the clinical data, right? To work with clinicians who are willing to help, allow their patients to participate in a study, or encourage their patients to participate in a study like this, so that you can actually accumulate enough data to figure out what are some typical patterns and what are some atypical patterns. But this is a challenge. I mean, this is I would say personally, I think this is one of the biggest challenges facing natural language processing right now, is that we focus so much on English to the exclusion of pretty much every other language, with the possible exception of Chinese. And we say this thing works so well in English. Is it going to work in another language? We don't know, and we may never know, because we may never have enough data in another language to really be able to do the things that we do in English. People are starting to care about it now, but it's not just in clinical data. It's pretty much all NLP tasks for any language that's not English. We don't really know how things are going to work yet. But it is a challenge. But I think it's a challenge we can overcome. We just have to try.
Thank you. Well, Emily, I would like to thank you very much for being today with us. It was really enlightening to hear at you. It was really a challenging lecture, and I hope you have a nice day. And once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me here. And I wish I could be in Buenos Aires right now.
Hopefully, yes, you have to.
Next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Daniel Lowe, les quería agradecer mucho por haber venido y sobre todo a los trabajadores de salud, sé que hay muchos clínicos viendo, les quiero agradecer mucho por el trabajo tan importante que vienen teniendo durante la pandemia, lo valoramos mucho. Sigo en inglés. Well, I'm so happy to be presenting Dr. Satra Ghosh, or Satra. He's my PhD advisor, and he's been extremely generous in teaching so many of us on how to do science in such an ethical and really altruistic way. Satra is a principal research scientist at the McGovern Institute for Brain Research at MIT and an assistant professor of otolaryngology at Harvard Medical School. He directs the Sensible Intelligence Group, whose research portfolio comprises projects on spoken communication, brain imaging, and informatics to address gaps in scientific knowledge in 3 areas: the neural basis and translational applications of human spoken communication, machine learning approaches to precision psychiatry and medicine, and preserving information for reproducible research. He's really a leader in the field of reproducible research and open science, which I value so much. He's trying to make all these tools we're seeing today free for users to use and other research to expand upon openly. So I'm like so grateful he can share his work with my home country, Argentina, and Latin America, and that you all get to meet him. Take it away, Satra.
Thanks so much, Daniel. And thank you to INECO, Marcelo, and others for inviting me to present some of the things that we do in our little corner of the world to all of you. Today, I'm going to talk about precision psychiatry through diverse sensors and machine learning. And our group story really, as scientists, is about making brain disorders visible, measurable, and actionable. For many of you, this chart will be very familiar, this graphic. Mental illnesses affects up to 20% of the individuals in every country on the planet. In the US alone, mental health disorders affect 1 in 5 adults, 1 in 6 adolescents, and 1 in 8 children. They have a staggering impact on the economy and will surpass that of cancer, war, stroke, and accidents combined by the year 2030. We all now know that poverty, childhood adversity, and violence have emerged as key risk factors. The prevalence of mood and anxiety disorders and symptoms has not decreased despite substantial increases in treatment availability, particularly antidepressants. And attempts at suicide are increasing. We are already seeing over the last year and a half the pandemic's impact on mental health. And with the changing climate leading to human displacement, if anything, the map is growing more red every day. And as a society, we're quite used to biomarkers. Now imagine a world where you could not do an X-ray or a blood test or a COVID test, for example. Unfortunately, there are no biomarkers, or stable ones at least, that we know of for mental health disorders. The current best diagnostics are not from biology, but involve subjective assessments from patients and caregivers. And many of these approaches to treatment involve trial and error. And this is where some of our work comes in. In this first part of the talk, I'm going to focus on individual differences or our differences as people and how we can use this to our advantage. And we can see it through this lens of precision medicine and psychiatry. Our aim is to see if we can change and create information that can be gleaned from groups of individuals to improve elements for an individual. And this affects many different components, right? When we think of any kind of illness, there's prognosis. Where will this go? There's diagnosis. Does one have an illness or a disorder? If you determine all of those things, then you have to decide on treatment selection. And sometimes treatments may not be available, so you have to think about treatment development. And if you see this as kind of a trajectory or a timeline, you have to think about how one can monitor an individual over a lifespan. And it is within this kind of context that we look at precision as something that we can achieve today. We have some of the tools. But since we are talking about mental illnesses and psychiatry, an obvious first step is to say, let's look at the brain. And we have come a long way from when we first started doing brain imaging in individuals. So I'm going to show you a video, and you're going to see two things in this video. There's no sound with this video. On the left is a slightly inflated brain. Imagine your brain like a crumpled up balloon. You now take it and you blow it up a little bit and it inflates it. And you're going to see red and yellow blobs on top of those brains. Those are regions where there is changes in blood oxygenation as the person is doing the task, which is what you're going to see on the right. They're either seeing things, or as it will instruct, they'll instruct the participants to do things. So let me play it and we'll come back to it if needed. So they're tapping their fingers now, and you can see motor cortex, looking at faces, and some of the visual areas light up. They're listening to music, and some of the auditory areas light up. And now they're reading what Daniel and I would call the rainbow passage, a very common thing. And you see all kinds of language areas light up. So let me just play that over again. It goes by fairly quickly. And for those of you who have done neuroimaging studies before, this is not the result of looking at maps from a lot of participants. This is from a single participant. We can now look at the brain and look at this variation of activation, which happens to be precise networks or regions from an individual subject. And this is what lets us kind of think about psychiatry through this lens of individual data. And when it comes to the brain, we've been looking at a few things over the last 10 years. We've looked at how brain imaging could predict treatment outcome for social anxiety disorder. And I'll go a little more in depth into this later on. We've also looked at how you might link up genetics and brain imaging information and how that might help to diagnose schizophrenia. And we've also looked at how real-time fMRI, and I'm not going to go into this today, can be used as a way to reduce auditory hallucinations in people with schizophrenia. And in real-time fMRI, what we do is we put somebody into the scanner, we're taking a real-time image of their brain, and then we show them their activation from certain networks or regions on the screen and ask them to change it through their thought processes. And that kind of self-regulation can have an impact that's being studied clinically in multiple clinical trials here in the US. So let me go back to that first study on social anxiety disorder. In this study, 55 patients were recruited for imaging from a larger clinical trial. And what they did was they did various kinds of MRI and a whole lot of clinical assessments before and after the treatment. And the treatment in this case was 12 weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy. One of the scales that was used to assess outcome in this is called the Leibowitz Social Anxiety Scale. And it's a measure of anxiety, and it has a fear subscale and an anxiety subscale. And what we can see in this plot is that over the period of treatment, as a group, everybody responds to this treatment. So there's a significant change over time to this treatment. Unfortunately, while everybody responds, they respond differentially, and they respond in different kinds of ways. So one of our questions in this context was, can fMRI, a functional MRI that was taken prior to these people going through treatment, could it have told us how well somebody would have done? Because if we know that the treatment does not work well enough for someone, we might ask them to do something else, not this particular treatment. So in this particular functional MRI task, they watched faces and scenes with emotional and neutral content. And they performed a one-back memory task, which is simply saying, is the current image the same as the last image? So they weren't explicitly paying attention to the emotions. They were simply doing this memory task to keep them attentive to what was going on. And we looked at the contrast, the brain activation patterns between emotional faces and neutral faces. So when they saw emotional faces versus when they saw neutral faces, and asked the question, can we use this to predict treatment outcome? And the answer is, adding this brain-based information provides a significant boost relative to just using the clinical data alone in this particular subset of people. So what we're seeing over here is the change in LSAS, which was the assessment measure that was actually happened on the x-axis of each of the plots. And on the y-axis, when we use a model that either is based on just clinical data alone, like the questionnaire, like things like sex and age, or when we are putting in these brain-related features into the picture. And not only that, we can go back and look at the brain and look at regions that show up that are responsible to help with this prediction. So it provides a view on where the processing is taking place and how the variation, and this might lead to a better understanding of the circuitry that might be relevant to social anxiety disorder. We also did other kinds of MRI, and one of them is called diffusion MRI, and I'll show a video over here, which gives approximation. Everything about MRI is a proxy. So fMRI is a proxy for oxygenation. Diffusion MRI is a proxy of connectivity, structural connectivity that's based on water diffusion in the brain. And we use this together with what's called resting state fMRI. And resting state fMRI is just simply looking at spontaneous fluctuation of the bold or the functional MRI signal in parts of the brain and looking at relations across these things. And when we combine this diffusion MRI and resting state MRI together, we can explain about 60% of the variance of response outcome in these participants. Now, this was a smaller study, 55 people or so. It needs replication, and there are studies out there that are coming and showing similar kinds of effects, as in, excuse me, you can predict outcome, but not with the same effect sizes. So we need to expand this out in various ways, in various places to do so. So let me move on to the other study, the one that's looking at genetic markers. In many places, this is the kind of thing that requires a lot of patience or a lot of samples. We were lucky enough through a consortium called the Genus Consortium that gave us access to about 1,500 samples and a prior study that used 100,000 participants to look at case control effects in schizophrenia. So we could narrow down the space of genetic information based on the outcome of the really large study. And what we were interested in seeing is, could we use certain types of methods to link genetic variation to brain variation to the diagnosis of schizophrenia? And I'm not going to go into the next slide in detail. I simply want to show that one of the things that we were trying to do over here is what's called a probabilistic graphical model. And this was what we are going to compare in the next few slides to a more standard machine learning model called L1 based regularized machine learning model. So what we're seeing over here on the left is the performance of these two models. The blue one is the probabilistic one. The orange one is the kind of standard model. And what we find is that the number of features selected by the blue one, the probabilistic one, is much, much lower than the number of features that are selected by the orange one. And both of them have similar performance, and we show it in this data set. But luckily for schizophrenia, there are some other data sets. We can pull those together as well and show that the performance is similar on these other held out data sets, showing that these models have some significant performance. It's not fantastic. It's not like I can detect schizophrenia on anyone with just genetic and brain imaging data, but it shows us that there's information that we can connect. But what's important is kind of going back and looking at parts of the brain that come about as a result of this model. And this is the kind of explainability that we want to continuously work towards in our group. Daniel is himself working on various pieces of this to understand why a machine learning model works. And here we can see the sparsity of the probabilistic model on the left. And you might notice that on the right, the same regions show up as the most selected regions, which is the darkness of the color. But it also shows other regions that were used in the classification. And because we are doing this based on genetic data, you can now take each of the regions that shows up in the probabilistic model and go and look at the SNPs that were relevant towards that prediction. So creating a connection between genes, brain regions, all the way through diagnosis. And now one can go and look at various kinds of pathway analysis or other things that one can do with this kind of method. And since we develop methods, we've been kind of looking at the world and seeing all these machine learning competitions show up. And one of them was this competition that was arranged right before the Human Brain Mapping Conference in 2018 that was looking at a set of data called structural brain images. And the question was, could you predict which of these people had depression or not? And in this data set, they provided about 1,800 participants worth of data for training the model, and they held out 448 participants worth of data for testing. Now, one of the nice things about this competition, which I really liked, besides the fact that we won, so a little bit of touting that our group won this competition, is that you were allowed to submit the model once. And in the context of machine learning, that's important, because if you can even get the results of your model on held out data, the test data, multiple times, you can overfit or bias your model. And so this is the outcome from every team being able to send the data once. And the answer was a mixed bag in the context of psychiatry itself. But there are multiple reasons why that might be the case. So even though our team, called Paranoid Android, won the competition, as you might see that our scores are very similar to the next few teams. So we all did very well. We just edged the next team by a little bit in terms of this metric that they were using. In reality, all of these teams were very close to each other and would have given you a reasonable model. You can't really differentiate between these. The good news is there was information in the brains. The bad news is the effect size of this model is low. Now, there are many reasons to say this is not a realistic model. The kinds of brains they gave us is the one that you can see over there, which was already normalized to a common space to remove all identifiable markers about an individual, just keeping the gray matter density information intact. And that's one of the things that would probably increase it if we had other pieces of information that came along with these brains. So brain imaging is an obvious thing when it comes to mental health. We have been thinking about other ways to scale this. And one of those ways is something that we do effortlessly. And this is something that starts off in children. We all learn to talk very early on in our lives. Even if we don't understand what they're saying, they seem to be perfectly fine communicating with each other. It is also one of the most incredible motor things that we do. And here's an X-ray film by Ken Stevens, who was a former mentor and director of the speech group here at MIT. And this was a full-frame X-ray video of him in the 1960s.
Why did Ken set the soggy net on top of his deck? I have put blood on her 2 clean yellow shoes. Stop.
And finally...
Sarah Scott, that's right. And how old are you?
I can't.
Try.
Hello, I'm Sarah Scott. It was my stroke anniversary last weekend. I had my stroke 8 years.
And the speaking gets disrupted and can recover. So we're still talking about the brain. We just have a different way of looking at it. And as one can see on the right, when you speak, it engages all kinds of the brain in terms of cognitive, motor, and emotional systems. And this is what allows us to think about speech as this window into the brain. We might look at extracting information from speech that allows us to look at different kinds of disorders or hidden states in the brain. But because we've been studying speech for a long time, some of our collaborators...
The rainbow is a division of white light into many beautiful colors.
Our collaborators have discovered new features that could be used to look at this signal that gives us additional information that we can use to process its relation to different hidden states in the brain. And with this in mind, spoken output tells us that we can do a few things. So some things should be obvious. And one of these things is a project actually just recently finished by Daniel looking at vocal fold paralysis. That might be obvious. You're looking at a speech signal. If your vocal folds are paralyzed, you should be able to detect it. And we were able to detect it with accuracies that were fairly close to 90% accuracy on the signal. But we have also been able to take some of these advanced features and look at differences in Parkinson's severity. So the UPDRS, for many of you who probably know, is a scale that measures Parkinson's severity. And as you can see over here, this particular kind of measure separates out low, medium, and high UPDRS by looking at their speech signal. But we've also been able to look at different aspects of the signal and relate things like phoneme duration, the little bits of words that we say, to depression levels. And finally, we can take this all the way back to the brain and look at regions in the brain that are affected or that change with depression symptoms when somebody is speaking. And this kind of provides us a way to think about the speech as a sensor, as a window into the brain. Now, if we're looking at speech, we might as well look at text that comes along with the language that's been produced. And Daniel and a couple of other grad students did this work last year, trying to track the effect of the pandemic through text analysis while COVID was rising here in the US. And what it shows over here is that obviously sometime around March, when the lockdown began, you saw all of these posts. They were looking at posts in an online forum called Reddit and analyzed about 800,000 posts across various subreddits. And this is the interesting part of that study, that if you look at each subreddit which focused on different kinds of disorders, you can almost start clustering the posts as if there was some intrinsic quality to the text that was mentioned, that the people posting in those Reddits had differences just based on the kind of support they were seeking. And this variation, while still keeping the clusters, changed throughout the pandemic and brought some of these subreddits closer together towards the health anxiety subreddit as the pandemic emerged. And this is the kind of thing one can start doing by mining some of these large data sets that are out there. So this brings me to the last bit of my talk, is thinking differently about data. Over the years, as neuroscientists, we like to see neuroscience through the lens of resolution, subcellular all the way up to whole brain scale. We also like to look at it in the context of different kinds of species, different theories and models, different applications that drive us, different tools and data analysis that we might bring into the picture. And over the last decade or so, around the world, various brain initiatives have really increased the amount of data that's available for people to analyze. And this is just a sampling of a variety of data sets that discusses or that distributes a lot of data about brain images or other kinds of things like transcriptomic data, electron microscopy data, time series data, PET data that you can get from a lot of humans and in some cases across some species. However, there's another kind of data that we are looking at in the context of psychiatry. It's really the data we produce. And today we produce a lot of data. It's not just brain images and signals that we can acquire with fancy machines, but smartphones and wearables. You've just seen how text or chats could be used to extract information, how voice could be used to extract information. The genetics, the clinical records, the microbiomes, all of this and their trajectory over time should be relevant to us. Our body is a source of big data, and we can use it to help ourselves in various ways. And towards this end, I want to talk about Open Humans, which is a project that changes the model a little bit. So all those other things that I've shown are about centralized stores of data that can be distributed publicly. But with the kind of data that we are getting at an individual level, some of it you may not want to share publicly. What Open Humans proposes is a different kind of model. And this is a model where there's a personal data store which stores all of my data. And I can decide who gets access to it by requests coming to reach my data. And this has two implications. I can put longitudinal data into this data store as things are happening. And I can say somebody has access to, let's say, just my wearable smartwatch walking data, but not my voice data. It's under my control, and that allows us to do a lot of things as we can get together. And this kind of system has been used by the Nobism community, which is the community that looks at cluster headaches, to organize something. So Roger Koenig, who started this community, found that a solution worked for him after suffering through 8 years of cluster headache attacks. And he wanted to see if that solution worked for other people as well. And this is the kind of grassroots-driven, data-driven effort that Open Humans kind of does. Another example of this is the Open APS, which is the Artificial Pancreas System. So this was a community that came together with engineers, with software developers, with diabetes researchers. They were targeting type 1 diabetes solutions at a time when they did not have automated solutions to drive insulin pumps or other things. And this was, again, a community-driven effort that collected data, created devices, and came together. And this brings me to the last bit of my talk. I'll summarize this. Our goal in our lab is to be able to measure things, to predict the future when we can, and to adjust things so that we can change this trajectory. We want to see individuals as various kinds of trajectories in a high-dimensional space. And some of these trajectories are going to go together, and some of them are going to converge, some of them are going to be attracted to a state. And we want to know what are the things that affects this. And we have at our arsenal a lot of things, because today's world is digital and almost everything is a sensor. So there are various kinds of objective measures we can collect, and they could be brain images and genetics, which are clinical things like health records, but there are also social communication things and sensors that we get from our movements and our smartwatches. Then there might be subjective measures, the kinds of reactions we post, the kinds of scales we do in typical kind of scientific and psychiatric study, and interventions that people are trying out at various levels. And these could be psychiatric visits, could be pharmacological substances, apps that are out there, or meditation. And we want to bring all of this together through a lens of artificial intelligence and machine learning, one that looks at signal processing, feature engineering, natural language understanding, to provide feedback to patients and caregivers and their doctors. And this continued kind of phenotyping helps us change the way we look at the world. Right now, a lot of things we do are fairly reactive. What we want to be able to do is to be able to measure ourselves so that when the time comes when something is off, we're able to look back at the history and inform ourselves of better avenues to pursue from that point on. So I'm going to leave you with this, and I need to thank a lot of people. I'm not going to put their names. We have had a lot of collaborators that have helped us with a lot of these studies over the years, generous funding from NIH and other sources that have also helped us with the studies. I want to thank Daniel, Marcelo, and the INECO Foundation again for inviting me. And with that, I'll stop and I'll take a question or two.
Fantastic. Thank you, Satra. Well, I was taking some notes on how to improve my presentation skills, because that was really fun. So, you know, there's a lot of clinicians and students in the audience, and one of your great skills is taking students without a strong technical computational background but are interested in clinical work and teaching them how to do data science. And so I wanted to know if you can share, like, what are some of the best ways to get started with data science and machine learning, perhaps for clinicians without too much programming experience. And then when you go out and read some of the literature, what are the common mistakes that people should try to avoid?
Great question. Thanks for asking that. Let me start with the second part, the common mistakes. I think that's a much more difficult question because that does require kind of approaching it with a set of skills that you only develop over a period of time. If you remember, I mentioned early on that we ran a study and then somebody else came along and tried to replicate it, and they got a similar direction but a slightly different effect size, right? And that's the kind of thing that you have to pay attention to, especially when you're reading machine learning literature or data science literature, is how are they validating certain things? And that part, I would say, takes a little bit of time to get there. In the short term, I think there are a lot of good places out there which talk about cross-validation, which talk about, has this been done in an independent data set? The more subtle things you will pick up as you read papers and things out there. So that's one. The second thing is actually connected to this, which is answering Daniel's first part of the question. How do you get to pick up these things? And today we are living in an amazing world where you have access to resources that are freely available online. And there are many different kinds of resources. If you reach out, I'm happy to put you in touch with various kinds of things. But you can go online just on a tablet and a browser and be able to work on data science things. And there are many things that are very educational like. So they'll start you off at a very simple side of things. Some of it might just be visualization and exploration of data. You don't even have to write a line of code to do that. And then as you get comfortable with some of those things, maybe you can write a line of code or two. I used to joke about this back when I first started doing work in Python, that it's one of the easiest languages to learn, and anyone can learn Python. It's almost like Ratatouille, the animated movie. Anyone can cook. So anyone can learn in Python, according to me. It just requires a little bit of time and patience to put things together. And today you can do that online. And once you do that, it's really a wonderful data science language that you can then explore a lot of richness that's out there. But you don't have to start with, if you don't want to code, there are a lot of other ways in which you can explore data, and there are many platforms and tools out there.
Fantastic. And many of the innovations you're showing, that include neuroimaging tools, have historically been used in so-called first world countries, and later being used in developing world. So if we think like MRI, it's quite expensive. And so are some of these speech-based sensors paired with machine learning different? Can they be used in countries like Argentina or India? What are some of the challenges, and what are the opportunities with being able to collect large amounts of data online from traditionally peripheral areas, right?
I think the opportunities are great, which is why not only are academics looking at this, there are many companies around the world which are interested in looking at what kind of information. The challenges are really with validation. It's very easy to collect this data. It's much harder to explain why we're seeing what we are seeing. And that changes. And if you remember one of the slides I showed, you did the work on the vocal fold paralysis work. It's much easier to explain why we might see a signal in the speech from vocal fold paralysis, much harder to explain why we are seeing a signal that's related to depression or some other psychiatric disorder. And one of the things we need to be able to do is to keep improving that explanation or the capability to understand those. And I think that's the current challenge. From an engineering mindset, you could say, as long as I can do test, retest, and show that this works, that's great. And I think we should do that. It's just that with a lot of these data coming online, there are implicit biases in data. You might have collected data from one part of this subject population, the accents may be different, and that might influence data. So a lot of rigor has to be put into how do you validate these instruments that you're creating from these signals. And it's not just voice. It's voice data, wearable sort of movement data has a lot of information in it as well. But you have to kind of see it through the lens of diversity and inclusion. And you have to be able to say that there is representation from age, gender, race, ethnicity, etc. that come into play. And as long as there's transparency about it, and that's the part which we don't always get. People collect data, but it's not transparent what kind of data they use, what kind of demographics that were used. And there, either you have to go through the standard kind of clinical trial process, even with these devices, so that there is clarity as to what those demographics were before you put things out there. But because the technology is so easy at some level, there are things that are being put out there without the kind of rigor that we might want to see.
Fantastic, yeah. Well, thank you so much, Satra. We really appreciate it. And everyone will be right back after a short break.
Thanks, Daniel, and thank you again.
Hola nuevamente. I'm really happy to be presenting Shirley Wang, an amazing researcher who's tackling some of the most pressing problems in mental health using very rigorous and innovative methods. Shirley Wang is a PhD candidate in clinical psychology with a secondary in computational science and engineering at Harvard University. She's been funded by the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship and the National Institutes of Health F31 Predoctoral Fellowship. Shirley conducts computational clinical science research to advance our understanding of why people engage in behaviors that are harmful to themselves, including eating disorder behaviors, non-suicidal self-injury, and suicide. This work has been published in over 30 papers and recognized through several awards, including the 2020 Society for a Science of Clinical Psychology Outstanding Student Research Award. Shirley serves on the editorial boards of the International Journal of Eating Disorders and Eating and Weight Disorders. I know her personally, and she's a brilliant and thoughtful scientist. I really think she's on her way to being able to provide some of the key solutions to prevent suicide. And so I'm so excited she can share her research with you all. Take it away, Shirley.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you so much to all of the organizers of the symposium for inviting me. It's such an honor, and I'm really thrilled to be here to share some of my work with you all. All right, so as Daniel mentioned, today I'll be focusing specifically on this problem of suicide. And so as many of us know, suicide is a leading cause of death worldwide. Nearly 800,000 people die by suicide each year, or approximately 1 person every 40 seconds, making it one of the most devastating global public health problems. Recognizing this problem, suicide research has been exponentially increasing over the past several decades. And here we see the number of published papers on suicide prediction dramatically increasing each decade from before the 1980s until now. But unfortunately, this increase in research output hasn't necessarily led to improved prediction of suicide and related problems over the same time period. Here's a graph showing odds ratios for longitudinal suicide prediction studies separated by each decade from before 1985 until 2014 was the most recent study in this meta-analysis. And if we were getting better at predicting suicide over time, we'd expect to see an increase in these bars, an increase in these odds ratios through each decade. But instead, what we see is that they're very stable and perhaps even shrinking down slightly. In reflecting this arguably slow or stagnant research progress, the suicide rate hasn't changed much over time either. There's even some evidence of it going up, but although we see some trends going up and down when we look back over the past 50 or 60 years, the suicide rate today is nearly identical to what it was in the 1950s. And so suicide is clearly a huge problem that we've studied a lot, but as a field, we haven't made enough progress on determining who's at risk, when people are at risk, or what we are supposed to do in order to prevent it once we can identify people who are at risk. And in this talk, I want to make the argument that this is because we're missing at least 2 key things. The first is key clinically relevant data. And we've heard a lot about this from the excellent presentations that have come before this one. But historically, we've tried to predict suicide using data just collected at maybe one time point, for instance, through a clinical interview, rather than observing people's symptoms as they go about their daily lives. And so we need more data on repeated sampling of symptoms and risk factors, ideally during the times when people are theoretically most at risk, for instance, when they're in the hospital or coming into treatment, and on a shorter time scale than what we've seen so far. So we really want to be making these sort of continuous or on the time scale of minutes, hours, and days type of measurements. And so that's the first aim of my research. The first study that I'll present to you today is aiming to collect and use this type of data in the real world in real time and apply data-driven computational methods like machine learning to improve our accuracy of predicting who's at risk and when they're at risk. And also alongside this data-driven predictive efforts, we also need better ways of testing our theories formally and rigorously against these data. So once we identify people at risk and we can accurately predict suicide attempts, what are we to do as clinicians? What interventions should we deploy? In order to make these decisions and find cost-effective, scalable, and effective interventions, we need better and stronger theories about why people are experiencing suicidal thoughts. And thus the second aim of my research in the second half of this talk will focus on using theory-driven computational methods to try and build and evaluate more rigorous formal theories of suicide. So starting with the first data-driven focus on prediction, when we think about this goal of predicting suicidal behaviors, it's really important to think about what time frame we're most interested in predicting across. So say once we meet with a patient, should we try to predict their risk next week or a month later, or maybe a year later, or even later than that? Clinically, what we're often most interested in is the short term. So in other words, when you're sitting with a patient, what is their risk of attempting suicide today, tomorrow, or next week? But if we go back to the literature and look at the follow-up lengths of studies that have been conducted over the past 50 years, what we see is that the majority of studies have used follow-up lengths of over 2, 5, or even 10 years. In fact, only 4% of suicide prediction studies have been focused on predicting suicide and self-harm in 6 months or less. And of these, only 1% have used time windows of less than 30 days. And so this is an incredibly clinically important time window that we just don't have so much data about yet. And thinking even more specifically about these high-risk short-term time periods, perhaps paradoxically, the most high-risk time period for making a suicide attempt is after a patient leaves a hospital unit, after discharge from an inpatient psychiatric unit. So among people who are admitted to inpatient psychiatric units for suicidal thoughts or behaviors, the rate of suicide in the 3 months following discharge is nearly 200 times the global suicide rate. And so in order to zoom into this high-risk time period with these high-risk patients, in a recent study, I used some data from an ongoing intensive longitudinal study in the NOC lab at Harvard, in which we're recruiting participants as they come into the inpatient psychiatric unit of Massachusetts General Hospital. And so in the study, we have data from 83 adults who were admitted for suicidal thoughts or a recent suicide attempt. And upon admission to the hospital, they completed a series of baseline surveys asking about their history of suicidal thoughts, suicide plans, attempts, as well as non-suicidal self-injury like cutting or burning themselves. And while they were on the hospital unit, we installed some smartphone applications onto their phones that allowed us to track their suicidal thoughts in real time. So we sent them surveys, we pinged them on their phones 4 to 6 times a day, asking about their current levels of suicidal thoughts and urges. And after they left the hospital, they completed a survey asking whether or not they had made a suicide attempt during that time. And we also examined everyone's medical records to see whether we could detect any hospital admissions for suicide attempts after they left this inpatient unit at Mass General Hospital. And so what's nice about this study design is that it allows us to go beyond traditional measures of suicide risk assessment, which have historically just relied on this one assessment, maybe by clinical interview or self-report, which gives us just one snapshot of a person's suicidal thoughts or risk at a particular period of time. But with these recent developments that we've been hearing about today in smartphone and wearable biosensor technology, this really allows us to get much more granular understanding of how people's suicidal thoughts are fluctuating over the course of hours, days, and weeks. And maybe we can use this type of granular fluctuation in the real world in real time to improve our ability to predict. So in terms of the questions that we were asking people on their smartphones when they were in the hospital, we asked them these 3 questions about their suicidal thinking, rated on a scale from 0 to 10. So how intense is your desire to kill yourself right now? How strong is your intention to kill yourself right now? And how strong is your ability to resist the urge to kill yourself right now? And so if we reverse score that last one and add them all up, we can get sort of an average measure of suicidal thought severity at each time point when people are in the hospital. And so in this next graph, I'll show you, it's going to plot the trajectory of suicidal thoughts during hospitalization for all patients who were in this study. And so on the x-axis here, what we see are hours in the study. And on the y-axis, we see suicidal ideation severity, that sum score I told you about. And you'll notice that the lines are different lengths because participants were in the hospital for different amounts of time. And one thing to notice here is that there's a substantial amount of both within and between person heterogeneity. So the lines are all looking pretty different from one another. And within each line, we also see a great deal of fluctuation up and down. And so we can break apart each of these lines by visualizing the 3 items separately. So here's the data for just one participant, visualizing their desire, their intent, and their ability to resist the urge to kill themselves plotted over the course of hospitalization. And we can get this data for every single patient who was in the study in the hospital at this time. And so now if you're a clinician or a clinical researcher with the goal of predicting who's at risk for attempting suicide after they leave the hospital, with all this data to use, how should we go about making these predictions? In this study, we wanted to test 3 different models and compare 3 different methods for making predictions. So the first was sort of the traditional method of using just one static time point. In this case, we used those baseline data using people's history of suicidal thoughts and risk to try and predict into the future. And in this, we used their whether or not they had made any suicide attempts, the frequency in the past month, the year, as well as their self-report likelihood of future engagement in these behaviors as predictors in the model. And next, another option is to use sort of the average level of suicidal thought intensity while they're in the hospital. And so we call this the mean model, in which we just took the average, the mean of all of those ecological momentary assessment smartphone pings for desire, intent, and ability to resist the urge to kill self. And then finally, what we can do is also try and make use of the variability that we saw, try and extract different features, and we call this the dynamic feature model, in which we are trying to use different components of each person's time series data in order to make predictions about future risk. And so to just give you a few more details about this dynamic feature model, what we did for every participant, taking these 3 items of desire, intent, and ability to resist the urge to kill oneself, we extracted a bunch of different features from these time series, including like the mean, the min, the max, the standard deviation, as well as other features like probability of acute change, which indexes the likelihood of participants making those drastic leaps up and down. And then we took all of these features for all of these items for all participants, and we fit an elastic net model, which is a machine learning model, tries to optimize prediction. And I'm happy to go into more details about this in the Q&A if anyone is interested. But to give you some more details in terms of fitting the model, what we did is rather than fitting it on the entire data set, this would cause overfitting because any data set would inherently be influenced by some sampling error that wouldn't be generalizable to other samples drawn from the same population. So rather than doing that, we used cross-validation, in which we first split the data into a subset and used that to train the model, and then tested it on a held out portion of the data set. And then we repeated this process again, training a model on a different subset of the data and testing it on a smaller subset, and iteratively repeated this process to conduct k-fold cross-validation. In this case, we tested 10-fold, 5-fold, as well as leave one out cross-validation. And then we can take the average accuracy of all of these different folds and try and get some estimate of how well our model might do if we tried to use it to predict suicide attempts for future patients who were not in this study. All right, so jumping into the results. So in terms of model performance, each one of these different boxes is a different metric of model accuracy, which we'll be comparing for the baseline, the mean, and the dynamic models. And each metric, a higher score indicates better performance, except for the Breer score, in which lower scores indicate better performance. So if we are really making an improvement upon the baseline prediction, we should expect to see some incremental increases in each of these data points. And in fact, that is what we see across nearly all metrics. Interestingly, the biggest jump seems to be from the baseline model, in which we're getting an average AUC of about 0.7 to an average AUC of about 0.8 when we go from the baseline model to the mean model. So even just using the average of the ecological momentary assessment items. And then we see an even bigger increase when we extract the dynamic features and use those in the model prediction as well. And of course, this isn't the case in all metrics. For instance, if we look at sensitivity, the dynamic feature model performs worse than the mean model. So this is by no means a final or gold standard suicide prediction model, but it does give us some indication that even just using these ecological momentary assessment items does seem to improve our ability to predict beyond a static baseline. In terms of which of the features might have been the most important in the dynamic feature model, this plot shows variable importance metrics for each of those features for each of the different suicidal thought items. And what we see is that the top 3 most important predictors in the model were the probability of acute change in the desire, the ability to resist, and the intent to kill oneself, suggesting that there's something about this variability that's important for predicting future risk. And one thing to note too is that because these surveys were being sent to participants while they were in the hospital, we had a fair bit of missingness. So we had some times when participants just didn't fill out a survey, maybe because they were particularly distressed, or maybe they were sleeping or meeting with a clinician. And so we were curious whether this missingness might actually be informative in and of itself. And so to test this, we conducted a secondary set of models in which we used percent compliance. So just on average, how many surveys people completed as a predictor in the models. And what we saw is that for both the mean and the dynamic feature models, this substantially improved predictive accuracy, bumping up the average AUC to above 0.9 in both models. And so taken together, what I think this suggests is three key takeaways. The first is that using technology like real-time monitoring does seem to be worth it. It's very high effort for both researchers and participants to run real-time monitoring studies and to complete all these surveys and to do all the methods. But this suggests that even when we only consider the average or the mean of EMI studies, there is an incremental benefit that improves ability to predict short-term suicide risk. And the second takeaway is that variability appears to be really important here. The most important predictors in the dynamic feature model were the probability of acute change in suicidal thoughts or intentions. And this variability is sort of by definition something that we can't capture unless we're continuously monitoring people. So that also speaks to the importance of these digital technologies. And finally, the study also suggests that it's not just what participants are telling us that's important, it's also what they're not telling us. Missing data do matter in this prediction. And this mirrors another study that was conducted by my advisor at Harvard, finding that sort of non-response to a question about suicidal thoughts was the strongest predictor of the transition from suicidal thinking to suicide attempts in a different sample of participants. But what this is suggesting is that we need to be maybe taking an informative missingness approach, thinking about why and when people aren't responding and aren't providing data, and using that to help inform risk prediction. All right, so in addition to prediction, which I'm clearly very excited about, I think we also need to take a complementary theory-driven approach to use computational tools to better understand why people are experiencing suicidal thoughts and engaging in suicide behaviors, so that ultimately, if we can make these accurate predictions, we know what to do when the patients come into the clinic and where we should intervene, when and how. And so in this next section, I'll share some sort of new exciting work that we're just getting started on. So it's very preliminary and in the early stages. But before I get into this, I want to note that the work I'll present in this section is the result of ongoing collaborations with this phenomenal group of people: Alex Milner, Don Robinaugh, Becky Fortgang, and Matthew Knock. All right, so in terms of suicide theories, in the suicide field, we have so many of them. As early as the 1980s and 1990s, with Schneidman talking about psychache and suicide as an escape from unbearable psychological pain. Around the same time, Baumeister proposed that suicide was an escape from the self and aversive self-awareness. In the early 2000s, Joyner proposed his interpersonal theory of suicide, slightly more complicated model, focusing on social factors. In 2015, Klonsky and May proposed their three-step theory that looks like a decision tree telling you when you will or won't have suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And most recently in 2018, O'Connor and Kirtley proposed their integrated motivational volitional model, with the most complicated model to date, with variables like defeat and entrapment that drive the emergence of suicidal ideation. So these theories have all together greatly advanced the field of suicide research, but importantly, they've all been verbal theories tested using null hypothesis significance tests. And what I mean when I say a verbal theory is something that's instantiated just using our natural language, or spoken or written language. So for instance, a verbal theory could be something like hopelessness leads to suicidal thoughts, which is a component of many of the theories we saw earlier. And while this sounds good, makes sense, certainly, it leaves out a lot of details that we would actually need to know what this theory is really predicting. For instance, is the relationship between hopelessness and suicidal thoughts between person? If I'm more hopeless than you, am I more likely to attempt suicide? Or is it within person? If I'm more hopeless than I was yesterday, am I more likely? Is the relationship linear? Under what assumptions does this hold? Are there any hidden mediators or moderators? And importantly, over what timescale would we expect this relationship to unfold? If I'm at some requisite level of hopelessness, when would I be at risk for suicide? And in order to illustrate, what formal theories can give us beyond this verbal theory, I want to illustrate this with a brief example from ecology, which is a field that has made great use of formal mathematical theories alongside verbal theories. So for instance, say we're interested in understanding the relationship between predators and prey, like lynxes and hares, and how these populations change over time. We could say something like, the rate of change in lynx and hare populations is related to their current population size and how frequently they're interacting with each other, which would certainly be a true theory. But what ecologists have done is taken it one step further and formalized this theory in the language of mathematics, using, in this case, a system of differential equations, specifying that change in hare populations over time is equal to both some linear as well as some interactive effects between different parameters and the current populations of hares and lynxes. And similarly, the change in lynx populations over time is equal to some other parameters being multiplied by the current lynx and hare populations. And then what this allows researchers to do is turn this into computer code and use this to generate or to simulate theory-implied data. So if our theory was true, what would we expect our data to look like in the real world? And this is just a simulation that I ran based on this formal model. And what ecologists have then done is actually go out into the real world and collect these data, real observational data on hare and lynx populations. And here we can see pretty substantial similarity between what the theory has implied and what the empirical data is suggesting. And this is something that we just can't get with a verbal theory. We couldn't get to this real observational data and say, does this or does not this not align with our verbal theory? What the formal theory allows us to do is sort of lay bare the assumptions of the theory and tell us how well it aligns with the real world data. And so in this new project, what I am hoping to do is to see whether we can use the same approach and the same methods to try and formalize a theory of suicide. And so what we're doing right now is trying to build a theory using our traditional sort of box and arrow diagrams, and then take it one step further by formalizing it in terms of differential equations, using these differential equations to then simulate data, which we can compare to the types of empirical data that I showed you earlier, which we used for prediction, and see how well they're aligning. And although we're just in the beginning stages of this data, or of this project, it's already revealed a lot of sort of interesting questions and concerns that we wouldn't have otherwise come up with. For instance, just considering this basic relationship between negative affect and urge to escape, sort of fundamental to many theories of psychopathology. If we were going to try and write a differential equation describing this relationship, change in desire to escape over time, do we think the relationship between negative affect and change in desire to escape over time is linear? If so, we might write an equation that looks something like this. Or perhaps at low levels of negative affect, there's not really any change in desire to escape over time, but when you get to some certain level, it does start to increase. In that case, we would write a very different equation that might look something like this. And all of these things are forcing us to get really specific and really precise about what we're hypothesizing. And so we're currently at this stage of diagramming and formalizing the theory as a mathematical model. And once we do that, what we'll be able to do is simulate the artificial data. And we plan to simultaneously be collecting this type of empirical data on smartphones and wearable biosensors. Currently in the NOC lab at Harvard, we're doing a study where we're collecting this type of real-time monitoring data on 600 people with suicidal thoughts, 300 adults and 300 adolescents. And then we might do something like run the same set of statistical analyses on both our simulated data and our empirical data, as well as visualize them like the ecologists did with the lynx and hare examples. And then we can use this to compare our results and see, are we able to actually reproduce what we're observing in the real world? And if not, what do we need to change in our formal theory? And then ideally, once we do have some sort of theory that mirrors the data that we observe in the real world, we can go back and tinker with it, add a variable, remove a variable, change a parameter, and simulate interventions before going out into the real world and doing a costly intervention study. We might be able to get some sort of idea of where we can intervene in order to have the greatest downstream effects. So this is just the first step in figuring out how to use computational methods and tools for better understanding why people attempt suicide and engage in other self-destructive behaviors. We still have a long ways to go and a number of limitations to be kept in mind. For instance, the lack of external validation in many of the studies that are currently ongoing, including my own that I presented, small sample sizes, as well as the empirical data quality. And in terms of future directions, I'm really excited to move towards thinking about within-person prediction, using people's past to predict their future instead of at the group level, in addition to predicting first onset of suicidal thoughts and behaviors, since many of our current studies are using data from folks who have already had suicidal thoughts and behaviors. All right, so I hope that these three approaches together, these two approaches together can improve our ability to understand, predict, and prevent suicide and self-harming behaviors, and ultimately make some actionable progress towards reducing their global burden. And so with that, I want to thank, first of all, my mentors and collaborators, especially my PI, Matthew Knock, all of our lab mates, and the research assistants and students without whom this work wouldn't have been possible, as well as acknowledged funding agencies, National Science Foundation and NIH. And thank you all for being here today. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions.
Wow, fantastic, Shirley, thank you so much. We have a couple questions here. One question is if suicidality can be considered kind of a coherent construct, perhaps like a syndrome, or something else, and how is it different to disorders like schizophrenia or depression? Is it inherently more varied and therefore less predictable? Do we know?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked that. So in terms of whether it's more varied than other disorders, I would say maybe in some sense, but actually I would maybe say the opposite. So when we have a disorder like depression, there are so many different symptoms that you can have, I think, hundreds of combinations of symptoms and still get someone diagnosed with the same disorder. Whereas with suicidal thoughts, it's still like quite a bit of variability, but maybe more constrained because we're just working with hypothetically one phenomenon of suicidal thoughts. I do think, though, that this question of what suicidal thoughts are is something that hasn't been explored as much as maybe it deserves to be explored. What people mean when they say they're thinking about suicide. Is it an image that they're seeing in their head? Is it a thought that they're saying to themselves? You know, what is this phenomenon really? I think there's a lot of interesting qualitative work that's starting to get at this now. And I'll be curious to see what comes out of that. But yeah, it's a great question.
Fascinating. And so can you tell us more about like the privacy and consent concerns we need to be careful with when using data science, especially with high risk patients? You also have clinical training. So I don't know if you've spoken to patients or family members, and you know, how do you think they view these issues? And you know, specifically with suicide, if it comes in waves, and you know, at one point maybe a patient wouldn't like an intervention, but then is it possible they may be thankful for it? So what are your thoughts on this, or what do you know about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the ethical issues are really paramount here, especially with the types of data we're collecting. So for instance, in the studies that I described, we're getting all sorts of data beyond the self-report data that I presented. We're getting the wearable biosensors that are tracking physiological signals. We're getting GPS data. We're getting their call, text, Bluetooth. So it is honestly very invasive. And I think this is where like a clear consent process is really important when you're enrolling participants in a study, to make sure that there's a really as clear as possible understanding of exactly what types of data we're going to be getting and how much we will really know about them. Because I think that can be sort of abstract when you just sort of say it, but when you actually look at the data, it's like, wow, we can know exactly, you know, where on a GPS you are sort of at all times. So I think the ethical issues are really super important to pay attention to. In terms of the clinical work that I've done with patients. So all of this has been a little separate. These have been research studies, but I have been involved in some sort of smaller ecological momentary assessment studies with patients. And anecdotally in those settings, I think patients have found it actually really helpful to be able to track their symptoms and to review them in our weekly meetings and say, okay, you know, at this time you were lower in this symptom, you know, what was going on, and really dig into that a little bit. So.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much. Marcelo, I think he's gonna close us, but thank you, Shirley, again. It was incredible. Yeah, you have incredible presentation skills. It's a beautiful, beautiful presentation. Thank you so much for your work. Yeah.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was so great to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Marcelo.
Shirley. Bueno, vamos a cerrar este extraordinario simposio. Realmente esta última presentación es una contestación a aquellos que piensan que no se puede hacer un abordaje científico sobre las preguntas complejas que nos plantea la conducta humana. Y todo puede ser objeto de un escrutinio científico, incluso un fenómeno tan complejo como el suicidio. Yo quiero cerrar este simposio y agradecer a todos los invitados. Tuvimos el lujo de tener al profesor Insel, a Emily, que nos enseñó cosas fantásticas, Satra, que bueno, es una cosa impresionante el nivel de investigación que están haciendo, sí, y este cierre, este broche de oro que nos regaló Shirley, que fue extraordinario. Entonces quiero agradecer a nuestros sponsors, primero a Gador y a Bagó, al personal técnico, a la gente de prensa y difusión de INECO, a la doctora Torralba, a Barbie Gorodesky, a Cecilia Frade, y Facundo Juan e Ida, por todo el esfuerzo, y particularmente yo le quiero agradecer a Daniel, que trabajó muchísimo para armar este simposio realmente, y creo que el gran mérito fue de él, porque logró cosas inesperadas, como la presencia de Tom Insel. Así que Daniel, muchísimas gracias. Como siempre digo, desde que lo conozco a Daniel, puedo decir que tengo un amigo que trabaja en el MIT, y fundamentalmente agradecerle a todo el público que nos acompañó, que espero que hayan disfrutado y hayan aprendido mucho de esta presentación. Muy buenas noches y gracias a todos.